First of all, I will thank all the organizers, especially Evrim, who did a lot of work for this conference, and then I will start. In this presentation, I will first of all discuss the problem of the role of the Prophet, which plays and can play in both Islamic and religious education, and to what extent the Hadith can be applied to peace education as a result of his deed. In the first part, the characteristic significance of the Hadith heritage for Muslim students will be outlined, and the importance of prophetic deeds for religious education will be explored. In particular, religious education studies in German-speaking context will be addressed, and consequently the function or potential of prophetic deeds for Islamic peace education will be explored. In the last part, the Hadith categories of relevant traditions for Islamic peace education are presented. According to Annemarie Schimmel, the Islamic prophet became a reference point in all matters during the course of the history of his influence, and consequently also his traditions. For centuries, children and adults all over the Islamic world were taught according to traditional standards by which they used to behave. In the Islamic comprehension, it is also unthinkable to teach about religion and its foundations without mentioning the Prophet, since his deeds for Muslims is a tangible expression of the Islamic message and the implementation of the contents of revelation in human life. The enormous significance that the Hadith still have today in mosques, academic discussions, and Muslim communities shows that the practice-determining dimension of his deeds and discourse has not in any way lost its relevance. That extent can also be defined as a reality-based dimension of prophetic deeds, which is also found in language educational plans of Islamic religious study from the perspective of religious education. Furthermore, a certain didactic methodical function of the prophetic deeds and discourse can be observed. Without the Prophet, the Islamic messages remain abstract. Only through him do they become practical for life and consequently enable for a reaching reflection with respect to real life circumstances. Contents of revelation thus became anthropological by their abstract and metaphysical character, through the Prophet's nature of being human and the prophetic human interpretation, and receiver their ontological dimension through the reference to concrete problems and situations in human life. This is especially essential for religious education and religious education for children. Children in particular learn less theory-centered, but rather through experience and with their senses. The fact that concrete images, role plays, stories, and parable plays an important role, especially in religious didactics and religious education methodology, illustrate the enormous significance of Hadith in Islamic religious education. Furthermore, the Prophet has an enormous theological significance. The Islamic creed consists of a combination of recognition of God and acceptance of the prophethood, and therefore of the Prophet's deeds. Without the latter, the creed remains incomplete. The Prophet was actively engaged in the Quranic revelation, and through him God reveals himself in the world. In Quran, the Prophet is described as an excellent example to follow. In addition to the book Kitab, several passages in the Quran name the wisdom, hikmah, which was given through the Prophet and which was interpreted by corresponding commentators of the Quran as a synonym for Prophet's deeds. For this reason, the way of life of the Prophet is also defined as a guiding principle to be followed. This comprehension can thus be described as the theological dimension of the Prophet's deeds in religious education studies, which regard to this dimension. However, the question also arises as to how the example set by the Prophet can be applied in religious education practice. As different as the role of the prophetic example may appear according to different opinions, there is a base foundation. Children and young people, as well as people in general, learn on the basis of example they follow. Whether these are self-appointed or selected or theologically imposed. This exemplary role seems to be even more prominent in youth, as a phase of self-discovery and self-definition, as can be seen from the following and admiration of celebrities and influences. Thus, the fourth dimension, perhaps even age and learning area specific dimension, of prophetic deeds and the role of the example to follow in religious education can be identified. These dimensions illustrate that religious education, especially as a place of value formation, cannot operate without an example and its confessional base, nor independently of the theological concept of the prophet as a role model. The function and the role of the prophet in Islamic religious education would thus be defined as a very important one. In order to define the intensity and extend the prophet's exemplary role and the hadith in Islamic religious education, it is essential to be guided by the curricula and programs of Islamic religious education. They constitute a legal framework of the contents, their intended purpose, and the frequency of their use. In this context, it should be noted that the hadith and prophetic deeds in general have a very high status. Almost every teaching subject in German religious lessons of German-speaking world is justified on the basis of relevant Quranic verses and hadiths, introduced with such verses or referred back to them. Yet should religious education then be used for learning hadith or for the fruitless imitation of the Prophet's behavioral patterns? The development and promotion of the religious maturity of pupils and students can certainly be defined as the most fundamental goal of contemporary Islamic religious education studies. This religious maturity is not achieved by unquestioned imitation, but only by continuous reflection on the meaning of the purpose of religious content. This requires, in particular, the consideration of what these contents can mean in the present reality and whether they relate to the individual's own living environment. This inevitably leads to the matter of practical dimension of religious source content and its concretization in the individual's own comprehension. In Islamic tradition, as mentioned before, the significance of religious sources is concretized and put into practice thought the Prophet and the Hadith. In clearer terms, it could be said that the reference of Islamic source content to the individual living environment and practice is and can be done mainly through the Hadith and the Prophet deeds, and consequently, that source creates and can create a bridge of primary sources to living environment reference in Islamic religious education. This means that Hadith and prophetic deeds play a very decisive role in the formation of religious maturity. Particularly important in addressing the same indispensability, push and pull factors of religious education processes. However, the prophetic deeds as an application of the abstract religious contents in human practice should not be viewed and received without careful deliberation, but should also be questioned. This requirement is not only a declared goal of contemporary religious education studies, but also compatible with justifiable by the basic principles of Islamic theology, according to which a genuine or profound faith does not rely on blind imitation, taqlid, but on a reflective and questioning religiosity, tahqiq. This can already be understood by the fact that the faith is not merely a lip service, ikrar, but implies over and above that an indispensable inner conviction, confirmation of heart, tasdeeq. Thus, speculative theology, kalam, also presupposes that a Muslim reflects on what, why, and how he believes. Such reflection can only take place if the individual primary sources are questioned as to what they mean for one's own faith, religiousness, and everyday practice. This does not mean, however, that all religious feeling and learning can be reduced to rational processes. Obviously, being a religious person also implies spiritual sensations, perceptions, and experiences. Moreover, not every aspect of faith, such as metaphysics, the afterlife, or the nature of God, is rationally comprehensible. Religious education also assists students in their spiritual experiences, their process of finding the truth and answering questions about what really makes a human being, his or her existence, goals or death. Yet, the rational argument should be as deep, as intensive as it can possibly be. With regard to the Hadith, it should also be noted that not every tradition, irrespective of its authenticity, is equally important. It is therefore necessary to draw a distinction within the hadith between content communication and categorical classification, particularly when it comes to deals such as clothing, attitudes, or manners. It quickly becomes apparent that the exemplary role of the Prophet cannot be applied in religious education without careful consideration. Furthermore, not every lesson, due to time-related reasons, can address in deep hadith analysis. However, a proper hadith can be found for each subject and used as a source or reference text alongside the selected Quran verses. The intensity of the application of hadith and the Prophet as a reference point, an example in religious education, is thus defined by the respective curriculum of religious education and the teacher's intention and planning of the extent to which the lessons are to be designed, planned, and conducted. The following section will now examine what the hadith and the role of the Prophet in Islamic religious education mean for Islamic peace education and what potential they offer in this context. In the German language, educational plans and curricula for Islamic religious education, topics such as plurality, tolerance, ethical values, or the promotion of social interaction play a very important role in addition to the development of competence in religious reflection skills and the development of religious maturity. Accordingly, religious education studies do not constitute catechetical or apologetic dogmatic mediation theory, but rather a subject for the promotion of religious perception skills and also important social skills. Peace education belongs precisely in this area and is founded and cultivated in Islamic religious education, particularly through relevant hadith. Starting from essays on the key message and contents of the hadith and their significance in Islamic theology, there is much discussion of a heritage with predominantly ethical content and motivations for good character behavior. Hence, the sources of hadith and the exemplary role of the Prophet can be used for Islamic peace education. To this end, it is essential for religious education studies to perceive the exemplary role of the Prophet in religious education, particularly in the sense of an ethical role model, and to relate to this relevant perceptual dimensions in the traditions of Islamic theology. The hadith heritage, with its prevailing amounts in the ethical moral field, can be perceived as a compendium on its own, whereas Islamic jurisprudence regards this heritage more as a compendium for norms or dogmas, and the hadith scholars see it as a source of content to be evaluated and passed on. In order to put the Prophet and the prophetic heritage to good use for Islamic peace education, the following section will explore prophetic traditions and categories of traditions that are relevant to their subject matter. This allows the findings of this presentation to be tasted and substantiated by means of examples. From a discourse-oriented perspective, it is particularly useful to look at the titles of the main chapters of relevant hadith compendia in order to identify peace-promoting hadith categories. The reason for this is that hadith research on specific topics and the inner Islamic context is mainly carried out through by the study of chapters with always titles, and the titles of main and subchapters thus play an enormous hermeneutical role in the perception of prophetic heritage. Accordingly, if we take a look at the main chapters of the most important hadith collections, the visible categories in particular appear to be significant in terms of Islamic peace education as seen. Especially in the Kutubul Adab, we can see such categories and contents. Since the collections contain countless traditions of positive ethical and moral behavior, the list of peace-promoting traditions could certainly be further differentiated and continued. For this reason, the categories here are only intended to serve as an example. Accordingly, the letter does not claim to be exhaustive. Now I would like to present some examples. The most relevant category of peace educational and prophetic work includes first and foremost those traditions that can be directly attributed to issues of war and peace. A very well-known and probably most fundamental tradition for Islamic peace education is the one that defines peaceful behavior as a religious trait of the Muslim. The first hadith show that a person who causes harm to others and is a threat to others cannot be called as a Muslim. In the second tradition, the mediation of peace between people is even more important than the ritual obligatory Muslim prayer or the compulsory almsgiving. Furthermore, the traditions such as the Prophet's farewell sermon, where the inviolability of human life, property, and human dignity is articulated, or the prohibition of harming innocent people, women and children in the course of war, are classified within the category of peace and war. Similarly, fundamental principles of the Prophet's peaceful deeds can also be derived from the Prophet's biography, Sirah, where, for example, the general amnesty and peaceful attitude upon the capture of Mecca have been reported, although the Muslims were military superior there. Hadith, which deal with Muslim peace offers before any kind of warfare, as well as treatises on Islamic hostilities, show that peace was preferred to war in prophetic work. Nevertheless, it must also be noted that battle and war were also a part of the reality of Muslims in the 7th century and of the Prophet as their leader. In order to contribute to Islamic peace education, it is important, especially in the higher grades of school, to deal with these issues holistically and in the light of contextual backgrounds. The same applies to other apparently problematic traditional contents, such as those concerning corporal punishment or gender roles. The recommendation of positive interaction, as well as the prohibition of negative social attitudes, is reflected in a whole range of traditions which contribute significantly to a harmonious and peaceful life. The visible contents are particularly prominent in this context. For example, the greeting is the first regular step of social communication, which helps to reduce the intersocial distance between people, to enter into relationships, and therefore to contribute to a peaceful coexistence. In this context, among a whole range of traditions of greeting behaviors, those traditions are particularly relevant for Islamic peace education, which recommend greeting everyone and a proactive greeting behavior. Hadith shows social assistance. I'm coming to my conclusion.
Okay, great.
Hadith on social assistance and a fair distribution of goods can be seen as a further category of hadith for religious peace education, as discord is essentially caused by social injustice, scarcity of resources, or social suffering. Similarly, traditions relating to environmental protection or the observance of contracts and the agreements can be considered as promoting peace. A distinction can be made between subject areas which can be used directly for peace education, hadith on peace, social justice, prohibition of oppression, etc., and those whose contents can be linked indirectly to Islamic peace education, such as traditions on greeting behavior or animal protection. The traditions that have been examined and briefly explained illustrate the enormous potential of hadith and the role of the Prophet in Islamic peace education, but must be also reflected in the context of those traditions that deal with war, corporal punishment, abuse of people of other faiths, or patriarchal gender roles, especially in the higher school grades. The examination, contextualization, and critical reflection of problematic hadith contents is therefore just as much a contribution to peace education in secondary schools as the application of the extremely numerous and quantitatively predominant peace hadith. Thank you for your attention.